potty jokes. I like that. We're going to do well. Okay, so now coming up, if you look up to the right, you'll see a clock painted on the wall up there. That's Kermsey's clock. That's a very famous clock. And we're going to pass a store called Kermsey's Curios. Kermsey's Curios was originally a clock and watch repair. Back in the day, they did not put billboards up when they had all of this open face. They didn't have all those trees coming up. They just painted their advertisements on the wall over there. As a matter of fact, where I pointed out that landslide, down below that, if you looked carefully, you could see painting on the wall. Because it's customary for the ships, when they make their maiden voyage into town, they come into town and the crew goes up and paints the captain, the logo of the ship, the captain's name, and the year they arrived. So they claim the higher up they paint it, the more they respect their captain. So if you'd like to see your captain, I have some scuba gear for you this afternoon. Okay, I'll explain that when yours is down low. Just kidding. Anyway, this machine right here on the right, that's actually a snowplow. What they used to do is they used to have to put 3 of those locomotives behind that snowplow because up at the top of the mountain, they get between 20 and 30 feet of snow every year. So that's how they would get the train down. Now they've resolved that. They just don't run the train in the winter. So this building on the right is a train depot. Very interesting inside there if you have time later this afternoon. Coming up on the left-hand side, you'll see another of the most popular buildings in town, the other left over here. That's the Red Onion Saloon. Now, if you haven't heard about that, you're going there later today, so I don't want to give you too much information about it, but, you know, for $20, you can get a 20-minute quickie upstairs. Very interesting. Oh, did I forget to mention a quickie tour? When they had to upgrade it for safety reasons and put fire suppression in it, they needed to pull up the flooring a little bit, and they found some really, really neat antiques in there. Clearly, I do not use a curling iron, but they did find one of the original curling irons, and it's very interesting because in order to, well, you're going to see it this afternoon, but in order to heat the curling iron, they had to unscrew a light bulb and screw the curling into that. That's how they heated it. That fascinates me. Anyway, this building on the right is another of the most popular places in town. This is the hardware store. Their motto is, if we don't have it, you don't need it. Pretty true. Now coming up on the right hand, that guy's in his jammies. Anyway, coming up on the right hand side, we have Kermsey's Curios. If you look back up over your shoulder, you'll see Kermsey's clock up there. There you go. And it's now a curio store. The family sold out. They don't do clock and watch repair anymore. They do curios. This building on the right has a neat show. It's called the Days of 98. There's a show at 2:30 this afternoon, but you're not going to make it back in time. But I'm going to tell you the story anyway. Now don't blink or you'll miss it. On the left-hand side, we are going through the Federal and Financial District of town, the one and only bank in town, Wells Fargo, and the post office, U.S. Post Office right beside it. So if you blinked, you missed it. We are out of the Federal and Financial District. Okay, so now we're going to go into the residential area. Now, this is my first season in Segway, but I did have the opportunity to come over here for a month last year with the company I worked for. I'll tell you about that later. But I was able to get some materials and read up and study up so that I kind of sound like I might know what's going on here in town. Now, the interesting thing is many of the stories, it depends on, well, who the author was when you're reading it. Because this next part that I'm going to tell you, you can take it for what it's worth. It may or may not be true. I kind of tend to believe it myself because I've heard it many times in the past. Back in the day, many of the stampeders who came to town were illiterate. They couldn't read or write English. Many of them also came from foreign countries where they didn't read or write English. So a lot of the buildings, you might have noticed, a lot of the stores in town are painted different colors. And the reason for that is so they could tell people, go to the red building or whatever. This red church on the left is the Assembly of God Church. Right beside it is the green church. That's the Catholic Church. Now, a couple blocks over, you have the white church, which is the Presbyterian Church. And a couple blocks further up on the right-hand side, we have the brown church, and that is the Mormon, or the LDS Church. Now, I kind of tend to believe that's a true story. It has not been confirmed one way or the other, so you can take it and believe it or not. Most of the stories I tell you will either be true or not true, and you can determine what you think. Coming up on the left-hand side is kind of interesting. That is the rec center. That was donated by the cruise line because, well, during the wintertime, well, they only have between 3 and 4 hours of daylight here. Not sunlight, but daylight. So they kind of hang out in the rec center a lot. It's a lot of activity in there. So, now, coming up on the left-hand side in just a minute, you're going to see the one and only gated community in Segway. But it's going to be gone. Here it is. Next year it will be gone. Apparently they've sold the property and they're finally putting in some apartments over here, or some condos or something. Anyway, coming up on the right, does anybody know how much William Seward paid for the state of Alaska? Pennies on the dollar, you betcha. $7.2 million. So this building cost $17 million. So we could buy like 2.5 states of Alaska for what they paid for that building. But you might say, well, why such an extravagant fire department? That's because, well, that's a fire department, police department, DMV, veterinary office, and you name it, that's it. The problem is we have no full-time doctors in town, so don't let that hospital sign back there fool you. We don't have a hospital. We have 4 nurse practitioners, and so we don't have any veterinarians. So when the veterinarians come to town, well, they have to have a place to work, so they'll only get one of the rooms over there. Anyway, so there's all kinds of exciting things about that Segway. Now, coming up on the right-hand side, you're going to see the train where they park the trains at night. That's where they work on the trains, take care of the trains, keep them running, keep them clean. And then you'll see a sign that says Gold Rush Cemetery. You have to turn in through the train yard, not this driveway, but the next one. Turn in there and walk all the way to the very back, and that is where you will come to the Gold Rush Cemetery. Now I have a great story I'm going to tell you about that along the way. So all the way to the very back, I'll tell you about some of the people that are buried there. Very interesting folks. Now we're crossing over what's called the Segway River. You might notice it's kind of an unusual green color. It's kind of a pretty green color, actually. It's because it's a glacial river. So it's glacier runoff, so it's filled with silt. Now my dog, since we live right here, we camp out in the bus yard, and so he likes to jump the wall when I turn my back and jump into the river. Then he comes back and gets in the camper. And now this silt is so fine you can't vacuum it up and you can't sweep it up. You have to damp mop it. So we do a lot of damp mopping at the house these days because he loves that river. But it is kind of interesting about that river. Now, if you've done your homework on Segway, or if you haven't, I'm going to fill you in. So coming up on the left-hand side, there's a road that leads off to a town called Dyea. Dyea was the sister city of Segway. So stampeders came into Segway. Segway had a population of about 20 people when a man by the name of Captain William Henry Moore came to town. Now, Captain Moore had a premonition that there was going to be a gold rush, so he wanted to build the railroad over here on the right, which is the White Pass, which you'll be coming down later this morning. Well, it took him about 10 years to get funding to do it, but he finally did, and they built the railroad. But before the railroad came, there were 2 towns. There was Segway and then its sister city of Dyea. If you were to turn left at this next road over here, then what will happen is you'll go 9 miles out and you'll come to the town of Dyea. However, if your ship had just gone 3 miles further up, you would have landed in the town of Dyea. Now, Dyea had another trail, and it was called the Chilkoot Trail. So the stampeders could either come up and get off Segway and do the White Pass Trail, or they could go a little bit further up, get off in Dyea, and do the Chilkoot. Now, in the beginning, the Chilkoot was considered the more difficult of the 2, and I'll tell you that story, and you'll know why. Now, then the White Pass people came up, and they would take their belongings. If you don't already know it, the Canadian government said, you will not come into our country and either freeze to death or starve to death. If you want to come into our country, you're going to have this list of supplies. So they gave them a list of supplies that consisted of something like 450 pounds of bacon, a couple of 100 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of sugar, salt, coffee, everything they were going to need to sustain themselves and feed themselves for a year. On top of that, they had to have the proper clothing. They came right down to the number of pair of trousers that they had to have. They had to have the hats, the coats, the gloves, the pants, the boots, everything they would need to keep themselves warm. Well, at the same time, they had to have their mining supplies. All total, this came to a total of almost 2,000 pounds, a full ton of supplies. Now, if you were to turn right at this road right here, it goes to a small tent camp called Liarsville. I wasn't in town 15 minutes, and I sent it back to my friends. I go, look, they named your place. And they go, you weren't there 15 minutes, and they named your place after you. I said, yes, they did. It's called Liarsville. Anyway, that's a tent camp, and I'll tell you about that too. The tent camp was a place where stampeders could get a hot meal, maybe a bakery, maybe have some laundry done. Oh yeah, then they opened up a saloon and, you know, things like that. And, oh, then came prostitution.